Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Let's Dev. Today we're continuing work on our special little project inspired by the Game Jam topic of no death. Last time we started building the project, focusing on the basics of player control and the enemy behavior. And we continue from there by adding interactivity between the player and enemy, add a second enemy to the game, and finally not only tie it all together, but also do some last minute tweaks. In other words, hopefully finish this thing by the end. Well, that's a lot to get through, so let's not waste any more time and get to the coding. First up was the new enemy, and boy is this enemy more chaotic than the one we've already made. So chaotic in fact that it requires its own switch state and state timer. We'd also need to keep track of a beam width, which would work as the quote-unquote tell for enemy's attack. That attack would eventually become a massive flower-style projectile attack. But first, I had to get the math right. And no doubt, I had a massive brain fart here. All I had to do was account for how many bullets were being spawned and properly draw the same amount of lasers in the direction those bullets would be flying. I have no excuses. I completely lost track of what I was trying to accomplish and wasted so much time here. Eventually I got it, and thus we had a simple sequence of the enemy charging its laser before firing a projectile in each direction the lasers were pointing. I almost had them produce lines of projectiles like you'd expect to see in a shoot 'em up, but that seemed like overkill. So I moved on while I was ahead and tied the enemy's sprites and colors to their type. Now that we had our enemies for the project done, we could focus on making them mortal. So I created a parent object for our enemies and set up the usual HP and damage checks that we've used in multiple projects in the past. I also added some effects like flashing their color type when hit, as well as some flickering and even that lovely screen shake. So now that our enemies are mortal, now we have to make our player, well, at least hittable. So let's break down what happens when the player gets hit. In our project, instead of death, the penalty for getting hit is time. Basically, our shoot 'em up is a time attack game, and getting hit will not only change the properties of the player, but also remove the player's control for a certain amount of time. If the player is hit by a projectile that matches their own, nothing happens. But if they don't match, the player then becomes that shape. And in that time period, we have an animation play of the player transforming into their new shape. Got it? Okay, so to start off we had to set up a sequence for our transformation state. And much like our new enemy, I used a mix of states and timers to set things up. Once again, I spent a ridiculous amount of time here, but unlike before, this wasn't due to a brain fart. See, I created 4 different animations that covered every possible shape transformation. The problem was implementing them. Some needed to be played forward, others needed to be played backwards, and all of this would have required a bunch of conditional parameters. And no matter what, the code was gonna be ugly. So after trying multiple takes, I opted for the simple solution. I would just have an animation for each shape conversion. It's unnecessary bloat, sure, but given this isn't a very serious project, it's fine. So now that we had our animations, it was time to apply them. But first, during the figuring it out process, I created a script featuring everything we needed once our animation was complete. This included what shape the player would become, as well as resetting everything using the transformation process. From here, it was as simple as checking for the player's current shape and their new shape. Using a 2D array, I had the proper animation selected. And just so we didn't get stuck in a transformation loop, I had the player become invulnerable for some time after transforming, which would be expressed visually with some flickering. And there we had it, the interaction between player and enemy existed, each with their own consequences of taking each other's projectiles. Now, because this was a time attack game, we had to have new enemies spawning in to replace the old dead ones. So I set up a check, and if there were no enemies alive, 3 new enemies would be spawned on random sides of the screen. Then I added a counter of how many enemies have been killed to the top of the screen. And finally, I changed the movement speeds of the different players' forms, with the square form being the slowest and the hex form being the fastest. And there we had it, our little shoot 'em up project where death is not the end. Admittedly, there was more I'd like to have done to add polish to things, including adding an actual timer since, you know, it's a time attack game, but due to so many difficulties this session, I was pretty exhausted. I'm also not sure that it would have made for a full episode, but I'm not opposed to the idea, so keep an eye out. If I can manage another episode adding the remaining few bells and whistles to the project, I'll be sure to do it. If not, that'll do it for yet another little experimental project inspired by a Game Jam theme. And that'll also do it for this episode of Let's Dev. So remember that if you liked this video or enjoy Let's Dev in general, be sure to hit that like button. If you aren't already subscribed, be sure to hit that subscribe button and be sure to turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. And as always, be sure to leave your thoughts on our progress in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.